Let's have a look at cutting our lining. So let's place our panel onto our lining. It's the bag lining, and it's doubled. And I'm just going to make a line 3 inches up from my cut edge at the bottom. Because my base panel was 7 inches, 7.5 inches is half. 3.5 inches is half, and I've got a ½ seam allowance there. So I just want to mark my straight edges along the edge of this here. So this is going to add my base panel to my lining, so I haven't got a join there. And I just want to just check that. Just want to actually cut So this is a double piece of lining, so it's the wrong sides in at the moment. So sometimes for curves I like to use a mini rotary. Now I want to shift that, but I'm going to actually just put a couple of clips in my side seams, so as that when I turn it round, I'm not going to lose or shift my lining, because I'm using my outside layer as my pattern. Oops, that's bad practice with a rotary cutter. Sorry. So there we have our lining, our 2 pieces lining for inside. So let's go to our machine. Let's find our center. So I'm just going to finger crease my center. And with a fade out pen or washout pen, draw a center line at least 4 inches down. Now this pen, it gets darker as it dries, and I'm going to mark a line about 4 inches, 4.5 inches down, depending on how far down the bag you want to go, but 4 inches down from the curve. And our zip pocket is going to be about 7 inches long. So I'm going to mark what I call my goalposts, so my start and stop points at the ends of my line. So there's my center, so 3.5 inches one side and 3.5 inches the other for my 7-inch pocket opening. As I said, this fade out pen, this washout pen gets more visible as it dries. So we need to put a piece of light interfacing on the underside of our pocket, so as it's got some support for our zip. So I'm just going to put a piece of interfacing just true off the end, so as it's square. This needs to come about 1/2 inch past the goalposts. So let's just finger press that line so I can see on the wrong side where this is going to go, because I want to press this on with an iron. Just make sure it goes past where it needs to. Nothing worse than actually putting some interfacing on, it doesn't even hit the spot. So we're going to just press that on, and I'm just pressing it very lightly because this interfacing sticks to the iron. So I'll give it a bit of a heavier press on the right side of the fabric. And it's sort of slightly taken some of my lines out, but I'm not worried about that. Now, this is going to be what our jets are. Now, when I say jets, this is going to be our bound buttonhole type pocket. So I've cut a piece of fabric which is 2.25 inches wide, and it's about 1 inch longer than we need at either end, so 9 by 2.25. Fold it in half, and I've put some interfacing on it as well to give it some support. Press it in half widthways, and then press to the center, like we did when we were making the strap for the bag. Sorry, my hands are in the way with this a little bit, sorry. But I'm just basically keeping those together. It's very hard to see when you're using an iron, and that's hot because it's burning my fingers. So here we have our, what I call our jets. They're our two pieces. They are one strip of fabric which we're going to create. We're going to sew a square onto the pocket opening. So we need to mark our start and stop points 7 inches apart. Now it's important that they are square, because what we draw here is what we're going to see when the pocket's turned out. Don't be fearful of this pocket. This pocket is actually quite simple. You just need to do one, and you'll see how simple it is. That's the pocket finished, and it's got a zip behind it as well. It's a proper pocket. It's a very simple version of it, and we'll show you how simple it is. So here's my pocket bag, which is, I think I cut that 12 inches by 8 inches, so as that it was a decent width, decent depth, but not too deep. So let's lay our jets so as that our seam that we press together is facing up. Try not to put your sticky over top of your mark, see the end, and we're going to sew a square. We want to sew in from the edge about 7 mils, which is, it's a generous 1/4 of an inch. Basically, the idea is to sew whatever the width of the strip of fabric is, it's 1/4 of that width, and we're going to create a square. We're going to sew a square in. Very simple. So try and sew straight. Get down to the corner. Count in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One more stitch I need. Looks like I'm going over, but I'm actually not. Turn. Now I haven't reversed and done a back stitch. All I've done is sewn over my stitches for about 6 or 7 stitches. So it's a nice square. Let's pull our tape off that has caught it into place. You can pin this, but I just prefer to use a tape because it's more visible. Turn it over, make sure it's symmetrical, make sure it's square. Right, so let's pinch. I've got a roving thread. Let's just pinch this lengthways and make a snip in between those 2 raw edges. I think this is the part that scares everybody. The rest of it's quite simple. So trim up this light. It's a guide for you. So just trim up against the edge of one of those raw edges. Stop short of about 3/8. Stop short 3/8. And then with a sharp pair of scissors, cut to our corner. Now it needs to be sharp. I use a blunt nose rather than points. So again, cut up, stop short 3/8, and then cut to the corner. So that's what we want. You You don't have to cut into the last stitch, but you need to be pretty close. So just moisten that up with a bit of steam. And then we're going to turn these into the wrong side. So try and keep those strips the same width. There we go. I've got a little bit of a pucker there, and I need to press that one more time. Don't worry about keeping those symmetrical, they're going to be trimmed off. Let's do the other end. Pull this through. Now just give those strips, or what I call jets, a light press so as that there's no pleat happening there. See, without interfacing, this will be very, very hard to do. It will be very, very fluid, and it will be all over the, all stretch and be out of shape. But that there is actually, it's quite firm. You want it to be firm. It's got a zip going behind it. It's also going to be in a bag, so it's going to get some use. So let's keep these symmetrical. And all we're going to do is turn this back like this. Don't flip it over. And just put a few stitches to just keep those two strips on the right side into position. Only has to be 3 rows of stitches, forward, back, forward. And that just keeps those into position there, keeps them firm. If you wanted to put some decorative top stitching on around the edge of this pocket, you would do it now. But it has to be quite close to the edge of the seam, because if it's not, you'll find there's nothing to sew the pocket bag to. So I'm going to get a piece of tape. I'm going to keep this pocket closed while I add the zip. If you don't want to use tape, then use a wide, long zigzag. Now I just lift that up from the wrong side and make sure those two edges are meeting together. You don't want any gaps because you don't want to see the zip. Right, let's find our zip and lay our zip on. Now I've got my zippers way longer than I need, which is absolutely fine. We're only going to be stitching it to these sections. Remember where the stopper is, I try and get that well out of the way. Just make sure it runs well, and then we put it face down. So the stopper is down, the zip runner is down, so it's face down. Okay, so it's face, because you'll see those teeth are on the inside. That's why we're saying it's face down. And just get a couple of clips or pins. Let's try and flick it around the place. And pick this up and put it so as the zip is against the base of them on the sewing table. The zip's against the sewing table, and we're going to stitch just to the right hand side. Keep that stopper out, keep that runner out of the way. We're going to stitch just to the right hand side of the original row of stitching. Don't worry about these seam allowances being so small, because even on a sports, a stadium jacket or a sports jacket, or even on a sweatshirt or polo, if you're going to put a zip in, these are the seam allowance widths that they use commercially. They don't come out. They don't come undone. There's no need to have a huge seam allowance. Right, so that first side has been stitched. Okay, first side's been stitched. Now you might see that the zip has actually slipped up a little bit. That's absolutely fine. Let's just pin that or clip that together. And again, pick it up, zip against the table of the machine, and stitch again on the right hand side, just a needle width away from the original zip stitching, or the original jet stitching. There we have it. Just have a look at that and make sure those edges are butted together and you can't see too much of the zip. You don't want to see it. Now don't worry about the stopper or the zip runner, the actual runner itself. Don't worry about that being outside of the pocket. So let's put our pocket bag on. That's how it's going to sit. So we're going to stitch one edge to one side of the zip and one edge to the other. So let's do the base first. So we're going to flip that up, center it, so it's even over each end where the seams start and finish. And again, we're going to do exactly the same as what we did with the zip, and we're going to stitch on top of that row of stitching again. There's not a chance it's going to fall out. So that's our first row. Pull the pocket down, finger press it, grab the other end, put onto the edge of the zip, make sure it's parallel and symmetrical, pin it or clip it into position, and then again pick it up, place it onto the table of the machine and stitch on that same row of stitching. Right, so our pocket bag is attached. Okay, so that's attached. We want to grab our zip runner and run it inside the pocket. Just push it up. Look at the right side, there we are. Pull it to the center or pull it away from that edge. Cut those off. You got to cut them off after you've shifted the zip runner, otherwise there'll be tears. And we want to sew around. So let's place the pocket bag against the table, and we're going to stitch about 1/2 inch in and do curved edges. Do curves at the bottom of your pocket, because curves last longer. Square corners get holes in them faster than curves, because keys and money run to the bottom of the pocket rather than sitting in the corners. So pin it, draw it, do whatever you need to do to get a nice finished pocket. Just sew back over those. And here we have our finished pocket. Right, now we have our pockets. Now I put a little piece of interfacing up by the top of that the bag, so as that it's got some support should you want to put a magnetic clasp in. So let's just put our one piece on top of the other piece of our linings, and we're going to actually just clip them together around the outside edge. And we're going to clip them together, but we need to leave an opening at the bottom about 5 to 6 inches. I try not to leave too much, but it means it's harder to pull the bag through. So let's just sew around down the side, turn our corner, and leave an opening at the bottom. So let's just, and it's going to be well, I liked to make it a little bit more of a generous 1/2 inch for the lining, so as the lining is not too big for the bag. When you cut a lining off the pattern from the outside of a bag, it quite often is a little bit big, so taking a little bit bigger side seam from there is quite okay. So I want to get to a point, reverse, trim, go to my next point, leaving a 5-inch gap. Yep, there's my gap. And then when we get to here, we want to do exactly the same and create some box corners. So it's going to be seam on top of seam. So put a pin in. We couldn't do this with the base because we had no seam at the bottom of it. It was just a continuous piece of the leather because it looks better. So we need to actually sew across this. And so what I've done is I've actually just made some templates. I've got a 2, 2.5, and 3, and all I do is put my little template in there and I just draw along the top of it. So all it is a right angle, and the length, the long edge, is the length that you need. Because that very corner is a right angle. So very simple if you've got a template. If you're doing lots of bags, then that's a wise thing to do. So again, let's have a look at the other. There we go. Box corners. Very, very quick. And there we have the hole, which is what we're going to be pulling our bag through. So let's then marry these two pieces together. But first of all, we need to actually put our straps onto our bag. So we want to have the shiny side out of our straps. So let's put those face together. So the shiny side will be against the panel of the fabric. Clip those into position. So you're looking at doing a 1/2 inch seam across there. So you need to have a 1/2 inch either side of those. And I'm going to tack them into position by machine first, so it's easier to do it this way. It's easier to actually stitch them into position first. Now for doing a sew round and for doing the finishing of this, I would suggest that you change up to a bigger needle, perhaps a 1490, or if you want to use a top stitching needle or something which is a bit heavier, do so, because we're going through quite a few layers. So that's our straps attached on one side. Okay, so we'll be stitching over that again, just making sure that you've got 1/2 inch either side, because that's what we want as far as our seam allowance goes for actually sewing the lining to the top of the bag. Very important that it is centralized. So we have our 2 straps on. Let's turn our lining inside out and slip the bag inside the lining. Tuck the handles inside. And we want to then put seam on seam. Use your clips. Now this is it feels quite tight, but it needs to feel quite tight. So I do seam on seams, handle and handle. You can use more clips than I am using. You can put them shoulder to shoulder if you wish. One in the center. Right, let's stitch this together. Remembering we have an opening in the bottom of the lining to pull this through. So there's no right starting point. I like to start on a side seam. I just think it's easier. And with a 1/2 inch seam, let's start sewing around the edge of this. Pull that lining up, because keep that lining edge even, and we're sewing around. What we've done is we sewed to the very, very edge where our needle slipped down either side of our strap. And so it gives us an indication of where our strap is. So our needle, I'm going to be sewing to where that black stitching stops. I'll sink my needle and then I'll turn my corner, and I know that I haven't caught my strap because I've only sewed with my needle slipping down the edge of my strap when I was basting them on, so that my base stitch shows exactly how big or how wide the strap is. So we're at the halfway point. One more stitch and come round to the opening crescent. That red basting, that will be virtually trimmed off when we trim back this top opening before we turn the bag out. So basically holding all pieces together. So we're coming down to the home straight now. A lot of people clip curves before sewing them. I never do. I think the curve needs to stay as a whole. It just turns better. If you're having trouble doing curves, then shorten your stitch. Right. Now, because this is a bag and it will be holding some weight, I like to just go over those straps and just reinforce them. Just so as that they are more secure, because your bag will hold some weight at some stage. We want to make sure that it can do so, not just reliant on one row of stitching. Right, before we turn it through, we need to now these are called razor scissors, and for a good reason, is that they're really sharp, and they're sort of like the those strong arm scissors. I can't think who they're put out by, and they are quite. They've got quite a phenomenal blade on them. And I can tell you that because I actually nicked my finger with the one and it just chomped through it quite nicely. But it's about keeping all the layers trimmed evenly, and through that top of that bulk, being able to cut through it without having to have giant scissors or having to have someone else help you do it. Because we've got quite a few layers, and them being short, you've got a little bit more pressure on the blade. Very awkward coming around the curves with the whole bag sitting there, but totally achievable. Right, there's my scraps gone. So I've got a little wiggly line there, and I've decided that that wiggly line needs to be straightened up with some better stitching. So I'm just restitching. I will have a look at the lines. I'm just restitching, and before I clip to my curve. So clipping every half an inch just around the curves. And again, these little scissors are razor sharps and they cut beautifully through the layers without very much effort. Okay, so that's just, it's not cut right to the stitch, it's away from the stitch, but it's still close. So here we have our last look at the inside of the bag. Let's just pull it through, be gentle. Right, pull the straps out. There we have it. We have our bag now. Let's just give it a little bit of a press. Be very careful that you do not touch the iron on this, because it is a no-no. It will mark and it will be damaged. So I'm trying to keep it away as much as possible. Totally paranoid about it, but for good reason, because I have killed a strap before. And I hadn't noticed until it was finished. So I'm pulling that curve down. This would be probably much easier to do on an ironing board or on a sleeve board. Plenty of steam. What I'm doing is I'm pulling the lining down back into the bag so as I can create that curve. The curve will automatically create itself, and you want the lining to sit slightly inside. That's what clipping that curve has done. It is very easy to overpress this because we've got to top stitch yet. So I'm going to free arm it, and I'm going to use a foot that has a ridge in it, so as the ridge will sit along the edge of my bag, and use it as a guideline. So again, starting at the side seam, longer stitch, bigger needle. If you're getting drop stitches, it means that you need a bigger needle for this, but it does take your time. So my fingers, I'm trying to roll the lining in slightly. Easier said than done. And you've got to keep on pulling the bag from underneath the from underneath the free arm. Some of you may have trouble stitching across there, top stitching across there. It's quite thick. I think basically if you use the right needle, you will have more success. I'm not using a top stitching thread. I could. If you find that's really, really thick underneath your machine, before you start stitching, get a rubber-nosed hammer or mallet and give it a whack. Just compress some of that thickness. The thing I found that was the hardest was choosing the right coloured thread. I ended up using a grey because it blended in more than the black. And okay, I can see the stitching over the black tape, but it was a compromise. Sewing colour is a compromise, because especially if it's vibrant colour, because what colour will control the finished look? Very hard to say, it's very personal. Done. So that's my top stitching. Okay, so we've only got a couple of things to do. And one of them is I'm just checking to see that I'm all even. One of the things will be whether I want to put a magnetic closure on. So I've got one side on already. And you're going to find the center. And the center of the closure is 1 inch down from the edge. So I've marked that. What I do is I'll often put one side on first and then mark the other, so as I know exactly where it's going to be. So I'll rock the teeth onto the fabric, and there's some interfacing behind there. We put some interfacing there, and I'll just poke 2 holes in through the fabric, just 2 holes for the teeth of the side. There's two little lugs. I'm going to push those through the fabric if I can hold on to it. Push those through the fabric, and up through the. I'm looking through the inside of the bag. I'm using the hole in the bottom of the lining, pushing that through. Put the washer on, and you bend those teeth back to the out. Well, I bend them to the outside. Some people bend them to the inside, but I think they're stronger if they're bent to the outside. So it's bent. Gosh, I almost missed that. So that there is then closed. And the last thing we need to do is to actually close up the bottom of the bag. So all we're going to do is fold those edges in and stitch them with a straight stitch on the machine. And I should possibly use an iron to press that, since the iron is so close, but I didn't. Just clip those together, and then very rare to see me stitch anything on a machine on a free arm like this. It's something I definitely don't do. Okay, so there's our closure. And there's our bag. Zip pockets and all.
So that's another So Sweepy video done and dusted. For more information, go check out our website, sosweepy.com.